So Nick actually had a great idea. We're actually going to record this piece so we can go back on this. You guys can work back through it, as well as help me to sort of critique further. I will say this was born out of a prompt that Nick gave me a few years ago when he and Jen were teaching with the second year we were going together, but actually sort of how to locate photography as a tool for analysis, but with these explicit steps that we understand through our foundational years in architecture. So by no means is this comprehensive, but it's most certainly sort of a jumping off point and will hopefully give you guys constraints. Please raise your hand along the way, work through, but again, this will be available as a PDF, and then when we get to the site, we'll also be able to expound upon it as necessary. So we'll start off with the idea of the constructed view, and that's essentially how we're going to look at the photograph in this semester and actually next semester in the architectural principle. And the father of this concept is Julius Schulman. He put architectural photography on the map. He is the reason why we understand modernism in the sense of all things transparent. I actually gave a lecture to the AIAS and people that came, and we kind of expounded a little bit on sort of where he sits in the narrative. But if you're curious, you can research and sort of Google him for further understanding of his methodology. I'm going to give you a short primer on his methods in the beginning of this. So here's some photographs of his, sort of show you various ways to talk about things. The upper left being a compositional set with a sort of simple paver set that's coming out of the sort of house there, and then the mountains beyond in Palm Springs. In the upper right, the high contrast of the shadow, the real filigree, tight grain up above, kind of raining down. And then two nighttime shots, both showing the true aspect of capital M modernism with this literal transparency, right? Sort of seeing through the volumes, and of course the reflection at night of the light structure in the photograph, almost like the yin and yang concept. And then of course this, if not the most famous, one of the most famous photos he ever took, which is the twinkling of the LA lights exposed out beyond, and then the transparency, and then this cantilevered glass volume of a house nestled in the hillside. And then here with actually the tectonic elements being guides for how you begin to literally frame a sort of system. So here's your sort of axis that reaches, right, in chambers of memory palace, the frame on the left, and then here the sort of frame being open versus infill. So this is literally an exercise in frame and infill captured in the sort of architectural language. So the methodology is this. You have clarify the compositional frame, and you can do this by actually literally flipping the image. You have the use of shade. We won't probably have this issue, but I like to also remind students that a rainy day is never an excuse not to find interesting photographs and ways to go through, because shade actually helps illustrate form and massing, whereas we'll see plenty of this in Charleston, which is shadow, with sort of the sun's rays and all things sort of texture. It reveals it. It reveals that sort of textural element. The constructed frame versus the implied frame, and architecture as the backdrop to events captured. This is actually a really exciting thing about photography, right? You can actually capture events happening in and around architectural moments. So here's a few examples. So here's clarifying the compositional frame. On the right is the finished photograph. On the left actually shows you, by flipping that upside down at Sverre Fenn's project in Hamar Bispegard, how I was really dealing with the sort of balance between the sort of 1/3, 2/3, literally 1/3, sort of the vanishing sort of happening down here, 2/3 above, 1/3 down. The diagonals, the meter, the tapering that's going on. So the finished photo actually isn't betrayed by being flipped. It actually shows you some of the compositional strategies exploring. So it allows you to maybe distance yourself from the literal nature of the photograph. So that's how you might flip. Shade, illustrating form and massing. We had one day in Malmö, Sweden on this trip we went to with the students, and this building, the Moderna Museet, got to show off. It happens to be a vibrant color, which at this point I wasn't interested in. I was actually interested in just the actual formal logic of the layers of this metal mesh on the facade, and then its sort of compositional strategy with the trees, and then this sort of white ground that is the sort of crushed gravel around it. And shadow, on the other hand, revealing texture. So this church, which is literally sort of embedded in a rock, sort of quarried out, literally excavated ground, the shadow coming through, right, and the sort of trickle, the louver, or the sort of bracketing, I should say, the tectonic framing elements show up really thick, right, because shadow itself actually begins to be manipulated, right? It manipulates what the form is doing depending on the sun's rays. So it goes from being completely in shadow as it winds its way up to being almost a 50-50 sort of split. And then, of course, constructed frame, looking up the bell tower at Markuskirchen. And so here you are sort of framing the sort of heavens above, and there's the bell in the bottom left there. So the sort of constructed frame, the literal sort of verticality piece, versus the implied frame. So this is Finlandia Hall. It's not an accident that it's located along the lake, but how the trees sort of begin to open up and give you a view back to, here's downtown Helsinki, and then Finlandia Hall sort of glowing in the sort of in the night there, like literally sort of twinkling to you, kind of calling out its pure white form against that landscape, but the actual implied frame that is that sort of natural surrounding. And then, of course, the most exciting thing, like I said, about architecture, right, is that it's literally a social art. It is about sort of spatial relationships for how we occupants interact. And here's this sort of child on a pretty much the most badass field trip I can imagine, which is a field trip to the Opera House, your most recent precedent project. Some of you probably saw this photograph I put on the Flickr gallery, but here's this kid sort of just playing with that triangulated landscape, and you sort of catch this moment. Of course, all the people kind of trickling around, but to her, right, it's just a sort of navigation of all things relief, right?
Yeah.
Nick?
So when you take these photographs, Bryan, and this may be kind of skipping ahead, but you're trying to frame these like shots in a certain way, but are you're shooting multiple images in order to get the one image, and are you cropping these later?
Sure.
To improve the image?
That's a great question, because what Nick's asking, right, is like the idea that what are sort of the givens? So far you've seen in most of these proportions, right, it's pretty much what I would say is given to me by the camera. And so I actually chose these on purpose for that very reason. So what you're seeing is this is the camera basically cropping. I'm using the camera as a way to compose the image. That is the most reductive way to talk about things in the system. Now with all things Photoshop, Lightroom, other manipulation tools, it's very easy to begin to crop and distort that proportion set to get at other elements, reveal other pieces. But typically, and I will get into this for your photography assignment, but most rules that you can follow is it's about a 1-to-10 ratio of final photo versus processed photos that actually make it, right? At the very least, it's 1-to-10. So every 10 photos you've actually processed for a final display, only one of those makes the cut. And just to give you an idea, the Scandinavia students, I only gave them at most 3 photos they could have on display in the gallery, and almost 12 they could turn into me total. So with that, that's 3 to 12, but that's their 12 final images. None of them took less than 5,000 photos while on the trip. So it sort of gives you a sort of scale of what you could really get after. And with all things digital, it's free, right? It's free. Yes, it takes up some hard drive space, but it's literally free.
It's very easy to see these beautiful photos that Bryan took and almost kind of get discouraged that like every photo Bryan takes is a great
right, and we're going to talk more about this on site on purpose. Yeah, yep, but that's a great point, Nick.
But it's just like our diagrams, you have to make 10 times the diagrams to get at it.
Yep, I have several of this kid, blurry, not quite in focus, the system. There's another person reaching into the photograph, and I really wanted to capture just this axis, right, this sort of fracturing form. So I basically wanted the child not to notice me, right? I had to sort of hide on one level around this to sort of capture this instance. And it's hard to hide on a bright white iceberg, right? It's kind of hard to hide. So now we're going to basically break out the certain techniques, right, systems. So these are in no particular order, except for the last few begin to sort of show a sort of composite strategy, but the idea that, like, rotation. So here is the Louisiana Museum of Art in Copenhagen, and here's a sort of compositional study in the idea of the open space versus the circulation zone in one area of the gallery. Here's Giacometti sort of talking to this wall, sort of in this space, right? Sort of tension of that figure. And then this is following a certain rhythm and then a meter set up the staircase. But I'm basically in line with something, right? So I actually have a frontal perspective, to use that term, the sort of frontal. Pretty much a single vanishing point happens, right? But it's a frontal set. And then when I turn on the oblique, look how the wall revealed itself as being this sort of lattice sort of structure, right? With the stairs kind of toned in. And then you see where Giacometti actually is situated is with another view back to the landscape, right? And also there's a painting on this wall. But literally by just rotating off the set, a wildly different sort of capture of depth, texture, and most certainly the actual proportional logic, right? This thing is flattened almost. It almost could be just in itself a two-dimensional diagram, right? This has a much different sort of set of rules about how we begin to perceive depth in space. And also look at the shadow, right? You barely notice the shadow on the Giacometti statue. Here it's like literally a sistered moment where you begin to see that sort of spotlight, right? It's not that the spotlight's not there, but it's much more subtle. Right here, it's literally sort of glowing. You can easily see its three-dimensional quality. Horizon manipulation. Okay, so you'll see many times my figure for scale is Jen, and so Jen is out here, and you guys know where she is now because you studied this precedent. But is she at the end of the world? In this photograph, I wanted it to be that way. I wanted it to be, for those of you who have not climbed it, Half Dome in Yosemite reminds me of this piece. When you actually come over this, you have no other horizon but the infinity that is this sort of granite fracture, right? So there's Jen sort of sitting. Then Jen begins to sort of be in dialogue. This day was a sort of stormy day, as you can see, but this sort of idea that she's beginning to sort of dialogue with another layer, right? The sort of railing itself is hidden on purpose, right? The railing isn't here. And here, because of the cut, now I'm revealing to you what's going on, this sort of subtle layer. And then finally, something that is not at all apparent here yet is what Jen's actually looking at, which is that, right? So when you manipulate the horizon, what I mean to say is you're not distorting where the world is. You're distorting how you view the world, right? So privileging me getting down on my stomach, which I am in that first photo, me stepping down 10 feet from where Jen is to look back up at her versus me looking down from there. That tells wildly different things about the exact same context at the site scale, right? But the photograph itself privileges the horizon. And I'm using the term horizon somewhat loosely, but when we're talking about like where that line is of all things vanishing, right? This is actually sort of played. And this probably told you guys a lot about that groundscape that certainly most of the photos or Google Street View couldn't, right? Because you don't get to look down like this. This was on purpose because I had never seen this photo myself.
This raises another point. We know that Thomas here talked about perspective, but when you're looking down from that point, you're introducing a third.
Yeah, and we will unpack that technique. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. No, that's a great point, Nick. Yeah, the actual down
Yours is
up.
actually slightly bowed in this photograph.
Yeah. So it begins to sort of talk about what Nick's saying is actually where the vanishing point is, right? Because I'm looking in here, things are going to come to that center, but this distortion actually happens because of where things are accelerating to. So now the framed view. I talked to several of my students about this. Some of you might have come up as well from the students that went to, on our trip. This is actually a new development that happened prompted by the success of the waterfront of the Opera House, only in private. This is the Astrup Fearnley Museum, 2 fingers over in the harbor, and it's by Renzo Piano. And instead of occupying the sort of central point, the building splits apart. 2 saddlebags, framing this view of Norway, Oslo's first blue beach in over 100 years. And by blue beach, they mean it as the water is clean enough to swim in. And we got to see swimmers. And several of the people we saw in Oslo on tours had never seen it before. That's how long it had been, and that's how new it was. But this axis that is the beach is actually given primary view through, literally framing that view. The building itself wants to almost capture that tension, right? So that's all one building, right? All belongs to the same party, but it actually begins to sort of straddle sort of system. And then, of course, you have literally the flame view. So this is an international style house, Village Stenderson, where actually I'm looking out, there's Brian Williams, who's a fifth year right now. He's actually taking a photograph from another frame view, right, sort of through, but I'm sort of capturing what these windows do. And there's our friend Glass Block again, right? Obscuring the view. This is all about the light inside, and then the sort of view framing out in that set. And of course, things like foreground and background. These are things that we deal with every day, but how you begin to play with this system. So now we're back at Finlandia, only this isn't an accident, but the sort of purple flower and the sort of lighting of the space, but also what I want to capture is my view from the system. Right over on this other side is a parking lot. It's unfortunate because it was meant to be part of a larger master plan of like a cultural part of the city, and it just didn't take off. But this is Aalto's most significant work for culture, right? And so what I wanted to catch, though, is you have this beautiful red. By the way, this is like 11 p.m., right, in the summer in Scandinavia. So you have this beautiful red of the sunset, which just feels infinite. And then you have this mist over the lake. And I want to get the layers, but I didn't want you distracted by the parking lot. You can even see this parking lot lights kind of peeking up. So instead, I used the landscape in the foreground to sort of deal with those layers, and then, of course, let Finlandia sort of shoot up off to the side, but really privileging the background, meaning the fog, by utilizing the foreground. Yes?
Do you change the settings at all on your camera?
We're going to talk about settings on site, and then afterwards I'm going to find out who actually has the ability to manipulate settings. This was not a requirement for this course, and I'll be able to walk you through those. But yes, I most certainly do play with settings. Yep. And then, of course, Pine Viejo Sanatorium, the landscape's not an accident. So where this sort of marshy area is and the sort of vibrancy of the landscape, the greens, this was an overcast day that was just kind of waking up in the evening for us. So actually the colors of the landscape were wildly exaggerated against the building itself. You know, almost seemed like surreal in that way, so you sort of capture. And then we have one of the trickiest things to deal with in photography, transparency versus reflection, sort of the sister moments, right? Now, Schulman shows us what you can do at nighttime, but you also can deal with it in the daytime. So here's Louisiana MoMA. There I am looking out at the Orison, right, the water, but you get why that room exists, don't you? Literally, the volume is transparent. But the only reason why you can see that transparency is because it is balanced light both inside and outside the space. That's why it didn't act like a mirror. Normally, wherever the most light is, right, is where the actual transparency will be the least looking at the other one, right? So let me walk back through that. If I'm outside during the daytime and I'm looking out a window, I'm looking from the lightest to the darkest. Inside's going to be darker. It will be a mirror to me outside. On the inside, as we know, you're looking out and seeing people. It happens to you all day, I'm sure, in studio. Most students don't look in. Of course, the inverse is you're a fishbowl at night, right? You guys are glowing, and all the other students that are walking by in the arts quad see you. You're on display, right? This actually allows myself to balance because you've got the double-sided. But that's an understanding about glass. Use that to your advantage. So here's Sverre Fenn's museum in Norway, Architecture Museum. You've got these glass louvers, concrete ceiling floating above you, and then this steel mullion set at the corner. You see constant overlap of this one tree and the louvers and the reflection. You're getting both transparency and reflection because it was an overcast enough moment where I could get both at the same time, right? So it becomes sort of a compositional strategy. And then, of course, Hank Skellinger, who's been on several of your guys' reviews, if you haven't met him yet, hopefully you'll see him on more. It's a second year M1 came on the trip. He and I were talking a lot about dialogue just with a puddle and like what that means perspectively. Notice how the building completes itself in the puddle, right? By manipulating my horizon, but you can literally play with something simple. And this puddle, right, is no bigger than this, only it captures the entire world in it, right? I mean, it's pretty wild what you could do with like literal reflection. And the reason why I show you guys these is that we're up against water. Question?
Yeah, I was like, did you change these after you took the picture, or you took them, like, did you set it to take it like this?
Oh no, yeah, this is actually, everything I'm showing you is single shots. So this is a photo, but yeah, your point about like, I made it grayscale for the intent, yes, yeah, and we'll talk about that explicit part for the assignment. But yeah, to your question, these were taken in full color, and then I chose to, yep. But that's actually how, this isn't three photos on top of each other. This is actually how the space looks. Reflections are pretty amazing when you have certain tectonics. Hence why we're always pushing you guys to go further, right? That sort of piece. And then of course, this is a facade that was a sheet of glass, and I basically put my chin up to a housing project, right? This is almost the exact vantage point of it, right? These are balconies that are red glass, but it's only one-way glass. That's why it's just kind of shiny red. And then this is the sort of window set, right? And I'm looking up the facade. And with this, the clouds, right, get in dialogue and invert. And you don't need a clean sheet of glass to do this. I would tell you this is some of the dirtiest glass I saw on the trip. But it's actually wild to watch the dynamism depending on, and Charleston, again, unlike Charlotte being up against the water, the clouds can actually be quite dynamic. And hopefully we'll get to notice some of this sort of the tension, but the sky itself actually had this dialogue with the sort of verticality. So this is a photograph that's kind of compositionally set up by understanding the properties of glass versus solid, versus fully opaque, I should say. And then we have something like depth of field. The question about camera type and settings, this isn't exactly the same tool as depth of field you might find in those of you who have manipulable lenses and camera pieces. When I say depth of field, I want to show you that the world isn't cracked up to the wider the better or the bigger the better. Where am I in this project? You guys know where this is? Right. Hey, Bryan has an 11mm lens. Nick must be so jealous that Bryan can capture the whole ceiling. This is a worthless photo. This taught me nothing. I took it on purpose. I wanted to see if I could learn something by looking out. I was laying on the floor, capturing thing. I was like, I wanted to talk about the module of the skylight. And I realized it did nothing better than just a simple diagram in line would. But what it did was I switched lenses while we were there, and I got the light fixtures and how they're on the same meter and module in just one of the pieces. So in other words, something that has this depth of field, right? I can only see but so little. I don't have my super wide angle architectural lens on it, right? Had a much better photo than the sort of wide angle. So that's just a cautionary tale in this lens costs, God, what are the lens I have? It's like $750 this lens I have is, right? And I use it for lots of shots that you've seen, and I've cataloged for different architects that I shoot for. That's a better shot. That's a more descriptive idea of the space. And I think we'd all agree, having been there, that's the sort of moment that Wright was after with that window set. So just a warning, right, that we're not just going for the biggest, but depth of field can be your friend. Light bulb semi out of focus, and then it's all about that skylight. And then we have texture and materiality. Let the sun do what it wants to do. Okay, here's an entry door to a church just outside Copenhagen. Grundtvig, thank you. Grundtvig's church. Look at the shadows on one side or the other, right? Just understanding what the sun's doing. This will be available to you all over Charleston, especially around our site. I can tell you the texture, the materiality that we'll see tomorrow is there. And then, of course, we just talked about Mr. Playful, Bjarke Ingels. These are balconies in one of his first housing projects. I will say, for all his playfulness, too, it is interesting. He lives in every one of his projects afterwards, which is kind of interesting. When he does a housing project, he actually gets a unit in there and then sells his other one, kind of thing. But you see the sort of triangulated shards. They create quite the pattern, and that's not accidental. He's literally playing with sort of cantilevers of concrete, the shadows that are described by them, right, the sort of system. And then, of course, Alvar Aalto, his experimental house, where he's literally playing with masonry modules. I wonder why the hell I put this photo in, right? I mean, the guy was trying to own what modular and masonry did. He invented brick types right here on this site. And by invented, I mean he figured out what he wanted to do with things that we still go through today. He played with running bond, stack bond, texturing, glazing brick, right? And all this is apparent in a larger tapestry that is his sort of courtyard of the house. And this wants to be a photo about texture, right, in this courtyard. And then we can go back to all things first year, right? 2D composition. Sometimes a photo is what it is. The explanation is about lines, right? And that's it. It doesn't have to tell a larger story. It actually is about that compositional strategy first and foremost. This is about a tension between a stair that's spiraling. It's in shadow because it's underneath part of the slab. It's in bathing in light from windows above. The structure is actually coming down because of the way I'm framing the camera. We'll talk about the verticals in the next sequence. But you sort of see how things are grounded at the corner. Compositionally, I've got about a 1/3, 2/3 proportion, which we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And then the sort of fine grain of the sort of gestalt of the one side against the big, bright sort of patterns the other. And you get that sort of infinite nature. And it's just an exercise in composition. It flattens itself. It's not about a stair anymore. It's about the sort of compositional strategy. Here's a shadow creeping in. You guys have studied daylight some already, even though we haven't had ECS. You guys know it from our earliest precedent project we had about understanding how where light comes from. Here's a shadow creeping in the morning in this clear story. Look at how it illuminates the module. Look at that brick coming to life against the sort of shadow, and then there's the sky through that, right? This is a photo that it told me to take it, right? I walk up the stairs, I arrive, and now I want to sort of talk to this. To Nick's point, I took about 7,000 of this area to kind of figure out what I wanted to actually present someday about the light. But that's one. And then, of course, the things of looking up a facade, literally getting the mirror. This is transparent glass, fully transparent like our studio windows. But at this time of day, it's reflecting out, right? It's so bright outside. And the texture of the masonry. So I've got the diagonal intention up there, got it compose down here, and then of course again my sort of 1/3, 2/3 rule of where sort of balance sits, just a proportional logic and system. And then this project, that's the new aquarium in Copenhagen. Again, the wall that's curving and splaying around, right? Look how a curve gets distorted, right? Depending on your viewpoint of it. And here's the big swath. I'll step down here. Like a big swath that's sort of coming out. And then again, the sort of horizon manipulated of that sort of system of where the water is here. And this is meant to be scaleless on one level, right? There's no figure in here on purpose. You may have seen a picture of Dakota I have of him that was in the gallery, which very much does ground the project, but here was meant to be scaleless. And then a few more sort of pieces. I won't walk through all the pieces. I just want to give you guys examples. These are just street lights. In Scandinavia, in the winter, they turn on different kinds of lights because of how dark it gets. So sun stays out till 11, It also gets dark at 2 in the winter, right? So they actually have different ways of lighting the street mid-afternoon than just street lights. And then here's another one of that transparent system of the louver blades, right, in dialogue. You may remember this last year. This was our poster for the trip last year. And now to the point of vanishing verticals. So Nick was saying, right, one of the things that's important in understanding is, like, I as a designer am author many, many drawings, just like you guys, right? We go through. And it's not just a pet peeve. It's actually a fundamental principle to understand, is that the world has parallel verticals in most everything we engage with these, our eyes. There is no camera better than them. There is nothing that adjusts better. And actually, that's what makes photographs so precious, is when you realize you can manipulate what the world was that you saw, right? Because we all see everything and nothing, right, at the same time, right? So what I mean by verticals, right? Vertical lines. When I do this, and you guys do that, right? The world doesn't zing around, right? It doesn't actually taper in, push down, whichever. Your camera does. You guys have noticed this. If you go through your iPhone, on up to your most expensive SLRs, you do this, things shoot up this way. You do that, it's because the lens is limited. That does not mean you should never have them. I'm going to show you why. But vanishing verticals should be thought about and be authored. Everything else, and you look at any ARCH daily photography to be the most superficial, things that show up as the sort of money shots of all buildings, are almost always parallel verticals. And I say almost always just because I don't want you guys out there searching, finding one, right? But almost always, because we experience the world with parallel verticals. That's an architectural shot. When they're not, they are not accidentally lazy. So this is a warning for when we get into Rhino next semester, that you're all dead to me if you forget this. And I mean this both joking and serious, and that is, dear God, it is the worst thing you can do, is to let the camera lazily do what it wants. Oh, it said it. And you guys notice this, you'll see fifth years that forget this, and it's never pretty. And I don't mean the review, I'm saying the image is never pretty. So when you want to set up something with authorship, you lock those verticals. 2-point perspective, it's called in slang. Thomas Bourget wouldn't allow that, right? But it's called parallel vertical. And then we'll unpack why you can use them to your advantage. Here I am looking at a column at Grundtvig's church and the chandelier. Yeah, that's not going to happen with parallel verticals. I distorted this on purpose. This is going up and becoming an arch. You're seeing the vaulting of the ceiling. And then again, the composition of this ridiculously ornate, yet simple on one level, chandelier piece. But that was a dialogue with me and the column forming the arch. Okay, so you guys get where I'm looking, right? I'm looking up. Camera's slightly tilted, but I'm looking up. But on purpose, this whole thing is vanishing to that point up there. That's purposefully, the vertical lines are being distorted. Here I am looking up in Milos Gordon, up one of his pedestals for his statues. These things are roughly, what, Jen, between 16 and 20 feet in the air? Is there a figure? I went right up, pressed my camera up against the column, and I'm looking up. This is tapering away. We know this column isn't this fat or that skinny. It's the same size all the way up. When you guys are there, you would know, right? But it feels that way when you walk up next to it, and these sort of figures are sort of perched on them, right? So that's a bias. That's an intent piece. Similarly, outside Grundtvig's church, here I am looking up to capture the empty buttress against the infilled church window, right? So that sort of system at play, right? I'm on purpose looking with distorted vertical sets. And of course, the reminder, hardly any architectural rendering, whatever we want to say of space that we do, right, should never not have a figure for scale. Same thing goes with your photographs. People are not the enemy. Sadly, in ARCH Daily and these things, you guys think that, oh my God, I can't believe these people are walking by my building. People in New York are so annoying. It's like, take pictures of people. Have them in the shot. Architecture as backdrop to events captured. So sort of using that can be really powerful to capture scale. Nick, sorry.
I had a point about the last piece.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
One of the reasons, besides the fact that we see the world with parallel verticals, is that it makes the architecture more stable to have those lines. If the lines are slanting in or they're slanting out, it's almost like it's falling down.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point.
And then you go to ARCH Daily, and it creates distortion. And you don't want to see your building distorted in the money shot.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great point. Like the distortion itself, right? That's the sort of system we're after. That's the sort of piece we're actually trying to control what the distortion we're doing is. By locking the verticals, you're not lying any more than the vertical taping. You're being an author. And so when you tell me you have lazy verticals, you're saying, I don't care, right?
In the computer, there's no excuse because you can actually force it to lock those
Yep.
verticals, not just in two-dimensional perspective, not just in the two-point perspective, but there's other ways, even in Photoshop, of undoing the perspective,
Yep.
like after the fact. So there is no excuse for not controlling it. You can't say that's just what the camera gave me.
Exactly. And I'm going to have tutorials for you guys that, for those of you who want to play with larger wide-angle photographs, I will post these to Moodle after the trip. We'll shoot away in Charleston. You guys will be able to play with it later to make things wider angle by just overlapping photographs, and it stitches them, but with an authorship. And again, same thing. You don't have to keep the lazy vertical. You can distort back, right? So with figure for scale, this is just to show you. There's Dakota on the left. Changes that view, I'm sure, entirely. I know it's a slightly different view, but the intimacy of that pool, right? That thing looked like it could have gone on forever. Dakota could jump, 2 steps through that pond and he's over it, right? It has an infinity. And then here's Jen occupying a Chahida project in Spain. But here she is at the center point of the circle. And for effect, I was like, she needs to be in that space to show you the ridiculous scale of this shallow relief, right? Look at the size and scale of that thing. And notice here, on purpose, I showed you distorting the verticals on purpose. I'm literally looking at the center of the circle, right? I want you to accelerate inward. And then, of course, here's Jen walking up to the Grove of Remembrance in Woodland Cemetery. And those trees are on purpose. That's an authored set of trees. That's not natural, as we've made fun of this word already, that hardly exists. That's a man-made landscape set that you're meant to go up, and you see the sort of scale of her on that hillside, sort of cresting the horizon. So these are those techniques listed again, and work back through. The reason why I break this out in separate slides for both of them is that you can refer back to them without the noise of the photograph. As Nick said, I'm showing you my work on purpose because you can ask me about it, and I want to be transparent. By no means are these the only ways to photograph those, and I hope that's explicit, but it's meant to be sort of set up in that way of being a sort of narrative. And then I just wanted to go back to the idea of this proportional logic, because it's pretty funny when you sort of break these things down. And break these things down to like what you guys learned in first year and what you just don't have to forget. And as long as you don't, it's always sort of there. Your photo can be a foursquare. And what's the thing about the foursquare? The center is not occupied, right? So you can have something, and you guys can break down almost all of my photos into these two things I'll show you. When you go with a foursquare, you tend to privilege bilateral pieces, right? Doesn't mean it has to be perfectly symmetrical, but we know from all things first year, the foursquare. You also have tension with the diagonals being about coming out of the center, so you can use that as a piece. I will tell you a good rule to follow in photography is if 3 of your 4 corners are balanced with a diagonal, something pulling out, it tends to compositionally complete itself. So by that I mean if something is pulling this way, and something's pulling that way, and something's pulling this way, you don't need that one up there. And by that I mean that one, meaning nothing has to be activating that for it to go. This is Nick's point. If the photo wants to be a square, make it a square. If what you capture is actually about 2 lines that are tapering here and go up, make it vertical. Own that crop mark. These dots are there on purpose. So if you want to use your camera as the crop, go ahead. I will tell you there's nothing special about that proportion anymore. Matter of fact, these are antiquated things. Like you guys still log onto a PC, I think, right, with Control-Alt-Delete. Nobody's going to accidentally run a program in DOS, right? These stupid artifacts that exist still, right? Same thing goes with the camera. There isn't a plate that's happening. The sensor can be any size. There can be no sensor. It's wild what's happening in photography right now, right? So you guys can actually begin to crop in that way, but also feel free to use the constraint. It's your choice, but once you constrain yourself, follow through with it, right? Sort of test it. And then, of course, the other thing is the 9 square. And it's that simple. 1/3, 2/3, 1/3, 2/3, 2/3, 1/3. All that logic comes from the 9 square. It tends to privilege thirds. It tends to have a figural relationship with the center and be occupied. Center being literal, again, to repeat myself, does not have to be the literal center of the photograph. But again, diagonals-wise, if you're in tension with certain things in 3 of the 4, it tends to compositionally balance itself. These are actually rules of sort of system. Nick?
You've got an app, you've got a lot of camera apps, but you have apps that will throw up a 9 square.
Exactly. Yeah, you got, and for those of you who have an iPhone, you have different, and I think the iPhone most current camera, even base thing, actually, that's a great point, Nick. Nick and I were actually talking about this last year. You guys see those grids aren't just for looks, for show. People like to align things just like you do. So when you take your photograph, that grid can be 9 square, can be 4 square. Use it to your advantage, right? Use that system.
And it helps you on the verticals when you're taking.
Right.
Yes.
And then lastly, the thing that as part of the assignment that sort of goes through when you're actually putting together your photographs, I'm going to ask you to do one thing that we'll call a montage. And it can either be what's called a panorama, which a panorama, although sometimes get oohs and ahs on postcards, is not the end-all be-all, is because panorama has its shortcomings and it's positive, right? Just like anything. This panorama flattens the world. The more pieces you stitch together, the more information you try in panorama, you actually have to flatten that world, right? We're not occupying a cylinder, we're flattening and unrolling. So this is probably a 160, 135, 180 degree view, starting from the hostel we stayed on. One time we stayed on the ship with the students in Sweden, and then its relationship to the historic island of Gamlestan. This is pretty flat. By flat, what do I mean? That shoreline at points is like a mile away, and at other points is like a quarter mile away. That building is right on the water's edge, and that building could be a mile and a half away. And there's no relationship to that depth. It's very hard to follow. So you have to privilege that. This was on purpose. I set up something to ground you in the foreground, the sunset around our ship, and then come around. But I will tell you, that does not in any way, shape, or form describe Stockholm solely. It needs other things, but it's on purpose. So a panorama you can use. You can use an app in your camera if you want. I would also encourage you instead to actually take multiple photos, and we'll show you how to stitch them if you haven't played with Photoshop already. And then, of course, here, this is a big circle with 3/4 of it completed with this tongue that comes in, and these are outdoor baths that we went to with the students. So we're all putting our stuff down. We're about to go jump in this ice cold water. But you can see this really interesting thing that you can't quite figure out. You can trust me on this. That this arc is completed all the way up to me in section. I'm now whatever I am. How many feet in the air am I? 15, 20, somewhere in there. And that arc continues through these little steps. It's a gorgeous plan diagram. But through my distortion, and on purpose, right? I'm taking this thing, this sort of pan around. It gets flattened. The lasso of this piece gets distorted. So you have to privilege something. This is about the narrative of us in this space, but it most certainly doesn't describe that circle or the sort of axial relationship, certainly, that has. But I show you it because it's a way to talk about it. So I'm going to ask you to do one, present one. I mean, do many panoramas. Or, for those of you who want to take on a slightly different version of this, and I know the panorama doesn't have to be explicitly separate photos, but we'll say it is, right? Then stitch together. Because that's what your camera is doing if you use the Pano app. It's stitching several images together, so you have to move slowly, go across. Is the photo montage. This is an Oteiza sculpture in Spain. This sculpture is this constant dialogue with this Corten steel in tension with this sort of figural moment. Touch the ground, touch the ground, touch the ground, and then rotates at this image. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 photographs that describe this. Okay? Sorry. 4 photographs that describe it. Sorry. 1, 2, 3, 4. There are actually 20 photographs I took of this thing for this purpose. Through editing, I turned layers on and off because I made it digitally, which is actually kind of fun. But these are separate things in Photoshop that I rotated. And this is the rule I gave myself. I said I wanted to try and capture the tension of this thing rotating. So every photograph, the middle line of the photograph, the center horizontal, is parallel or aligned with an axis of the sculpture. And I'll turn on the diagram layer. Here we go. But I'm literally rotating with an authority. I'm not just willy-nilly doing this, right? It's actually that. So the red is what I'm using to align center of the photograph. And then I'm actually rotating around in tension. So do you see how I couldn't fit it all in the frame? I had many ways to do this, but I could actually begin to describe the rotational aspect of it by going. So one photo, then I copied this layer in Photoshop, layer 2 gets rotated slightly, and all you use is transparency, right, to overlay them. You guys can imagine, like, I'll do the Nick thing with printing, right? In my day, the photographs are opaque and they're analog, and you had to layer them, right? But you can imagine, right, if I want to layer that system, I can use transparency to get it rotated perfectly aligned. And then I basically, the only place where this gives away that it's a montage, and I love it for that purpose, is the center. Look at that line. I can tell you guys for sure that's a straight line on one piece of metal. But look at that sort of zigzag right there. and yeah, the sky slightly tweaks because the way it exposes, but you sort of see it's actually at the very point that I was trying to capture is where it's kind of exploding. It's almost like a universes are colliding, right? It exists in two different universes, right? It's a tension. And so that's the system. That's a way to capture a montage. So when we say either or, take them all. Take different montage type things. Basically what I'm saying is a panorama is a specific or a linear version of a montage. A montage can be as abstract as this for our purposes. Okay? So can I just make sure that I don't see any hands raised? Did that make sense about panorama versus montage? A specific version? Okay. And so with that, in the assignment set,
The PDF is open.
yeah, so you guys, I guess we don't even need to print this off because it's already in their site sheet, right? The actual PDF, right? They can just look at this online of the taxonomy template, right?
That
The
one.
taxonomy, spectrum.
Yeah, is already on the site sheet. Okay, so this is the thing you guys are going to open. I guess, Nick, I got to open this one, right, for yours?
You have a different version of
Yeah.
design than I do. I just discovered today.
Yeah, and that's okay because this CS.
Okay.
Yeah, so I exported what's called an IDML file because I have the newest version of InDesign, and most of you guys don't have, I think, the Creative
We don't
Cloud
even
one.
have it here.
Yeah, so IDML will work with CS4 or later, and I think all of you told me you had either CS5 or CS6. So what this is it's a taxonomy template that uses the terms that are already in your site analysis suite. That's why I apologize. I was talking to Nick and Jen about something you haven't seen yet. Is this thing, and all I want to do is show you. It's a simple plug and play based on your reading of the site, not our entire class's reading, not the system. It's actually got a spectrum, and I'll zoom in. Degree of regularity, degree of irregularity. And lo and behold, what did Nick and Jen give us earlier? Was working from, let me go up here, sorry. The top upper left is repetition rhythm. Its nemesis, for lack of a better term, right? Sort of opposite, is isolated or arrhythmic. And what you're meant to do is, and I'm going to put an example PDF up on the the Moodle, and that is you start from here as ground zero. If it's regular and rhythmic, it starts here, and you have more photos of it. You only have one photo that's arrhythmic. And this is in around our site. Our site scale is yes. It's whatever you sort of need, what you describe our site around it, sort of in that system. Is it rainbow row and in? So that system? Question?
So those descriptive terms are describing the quality of the photograph?
The photograph's actually trying to capture what the photograph's trying to capture. Yep. So, and notice one of the things I did, much like the Scandinavia students, I gave you a crop. For this, you actually can only put the photo in a 3x3. They all show up the same. What you do inside that 3x3, how you crop the thing, but they're all square, and this is purposeful. Because what this is setting up is another 24x36, where you give us your photographs. And by your photographs, we're going to say, I think, we'll talk about this, I think, on site a little bit more, but I think no less than 3, but no more than X. And one of them is a montage, and the rest are, again, yes, where you sort of need, right, sort of prompts. But you're going to use this as a way to describe your reading of the sites through photographs. So I'll just go back through and show you, just so you know we're not lying to you, is in the prompts, you've got figural elements, symmetry, and so on, right? You're going to go through directionality and grain, linear organization. And so when you look at this thing, right, you end up with a taxonomy that may be growing from the edges or from the inside out and have empty boxes because you didn't notice that many things that were irregular. Or you noticed a lot that was irregular and found very hard to find repetition. And I will tell you what's really fun about the taxonomy is the different ways we read things. And you're not meant to whisper to each other and find the same photograph. You actually can be sort of authored in that way. And I just wanted to make sure, apologize, yeah, I actually have one.
That one's open.
Yeah.
You were pretty good, so.
So this is one of those from a few years ago that the grad students did. I find this dangerous to try and fit the panorama, or sorry, the montage on the page. So I actually didn't have this piece. This would be separate. So this was their panorama, and this is their taxonomy. Degree of regularity, degree of irregularity, growing from the middle. They happen to have circles that year. I think those are too busy. Looks like Connect 4 anyway. And then this was their sort of vicinity map for their site. We're kind of breaking things out different, but this is just to show you Do you want to do a whitewash picture behind? Be cautious when you break rules, right? Because there's a reason why I gave you a white background. But that being said, the main logic, right? You're not trying to distract from this being a turd, right? I don't care about this photo as much as I care about the content of these, right? You're not fooling me when you sort of show something busy. So again, this would be an example of a student that chose the montage being separate photos stitched across. Again, I just don't want the page to be, this thing was humongous. This was like, I want to say it was like 36 by 42. It was something ridiculous. So we'll just break that out as a separate sheet. Your choice about how it gets arranged, right? So I constrain you on one page, your other 24 by 36, you get to go. Do we have another question?
The goal is not to necessarily fill all of the 3 squares, but it's to be very
Yep.
deliberate about trying to capture those qualities on or near our site.
Yep. Yep. And so to that point, right, this taxonomy piece, this example is only meant to show you guys, like, I tend to use them, and Nick agrees with this from years ago when we talked about, sometimes it's really hard to show you guys something and not be like, well, why are we showing this and not having it explicitly get done, or does it put you in a box? This is actually to show you what happens when you have this sort of authorship of these definitely intimate little single pieces. What also wanted to show you is some of them repeat in different categories, which is interesting. And that is not by accident, because they ran out of photos, right? You saw how much white space. So it's about the white space left, can be authored, and of course, that piece. The actual piece is repeated. Maybe a photo goes. But that 3 by 3 is also, like I said, it's not meant to be frustrating. It's meant to be sort of about grabbing a taxonomy. So it probably doesn't want to be a large panorama fit in a 3 by 3. These probably want to be singular calculated shots that go about and capture things, right? Okay? Just a quick show of hands. How many of you have a camera that you'll be bringing tomorrow that has the ability to manipulate itself manually in some way? Okay, so what we're going to do is, those of you, want you guys to feel free to bring anything you like. This is not only acceptable, it's understood that this might be a driver for you. I just want you guys to be better about editing, careful, but the JPEGs that are gotten out of it, you're not meant to spend all day post-processing. It's about the photo being authored, right? That instance through the camera, right? This is not a photography course in that sense. And then for those of you who have the other spectrum, the SLRs or manipulative camera, on site, we are going to walk through different things that were brought up about depth of field, about playing with your shutter speed, because you can, and you should be able to play with them. But I will break those down with anyone who'd like to talk about them on the walk or specifically at the site ad nauseum. I will listen to any question you have. I promise you that's what I did for 5 weeks in Scandinavia, was actually break down systems, because not every student had a digital camera, a SLR camera, but most did, and several of them came in having never done anything but turn it on. They got it for the trip, right? So I'd be happy to walk you through systems. I would just ask you to know what your manual settings are, like what you actually do with it, right? But it's pretty straightforward, and I look forward to talking to you about that piece, okay?
That being said, like, this is the important part, not the settings in the camera, not the
Yep.
Photoshop or anything, but it's the compositional strategies that we're talking about, which I think this exercise really gets you into.
Yep.
This is the valuable stuff.
Yep, and I will say that's actually the biggest most nerve-wracking thing I think Nick and Jed had last year when I came in to talk about landscape photography, is actually, I'm not here to show off to you. I don't want your applause about like, oh my God, that photo is the greatest. I'm trying to show you things that I've used as analysis. I will tell you, I've updated this lecture now 5 times in 3 years. Shows you how fast I'm taking photos. And I keep going through and I keep learning. And when I last saw Ashlyn and Elle and Lucas and Yamar, whoever else was in the AIS thing, there have since been questions that came out of that we've, of course, specifically tailored. And I even mentioned them in the presentation that it would be different in that purpose about taxonomy and sets. So yeah, the iPhone, I know some cameras, you not all don't have iPhones as your cell phone, but a cell phone camera on up to the SLR, that's not an excuse for one way or the other. Oh, I have a crappy submission because my camera is not as expensive. Or, oh, I've got this great camera, I'm going to spend all this time post-processing a photo. I promise you, after hours and through tutorials I can send you and other things you can talk to the Scandinavia students about, you can geek out on this stuff. But for our course, this is about analytical photography, another tool in the diagram. So we know we have orthographics this semester, and we have the model. The moment the orthographics couldn't do something, we don't go to tone. We don't go to wallpapering, we go to the model, right? The analytical model for three-dimensional wrestling. Similarly now, we now will have the orthographic diagram, the model, and now the photograph. Okay? Those will be the three things you'll be armed with when you go around. So I think that's an important thing to know. So take photos anywhere and everywhere you like, but we're going to talk about on the walk tomorrow is some of you may actually play with things like the version of a stop motion video. What if your montage isn't put together, but it's actually broken up in sequences? Brian, this is what it's like to experience the seawall every 5 paces. This is what it's like. That's actually an authored thing that's much more interesting than, oh my God, do you want to buy my Charleston postcard? It's like, who cares, right? We're not interested in that. I think that's an important thing about why you'll have this second sheet. That'll be to show your personality and your interest in the bias of all things sight, right? But I would imagine for the 5 photos you might have on that second page and the 15 you might have on this taxonomy, if you don't have 10 times that amount that are worthy, you're probably not taking enough photos. So that means you probably have 50 times that amount later, right? So this is the exact opposite of the, my grandparents went on a trip to the Caribbean and they uploaded 267 photos to Facebook. Who here has ever looked at any of those, right? Whereas I went to the Caribbean, I posted 3 photos. That album interests me, right? So I went to Charleston, these are the 6 photos. I think you get people's attention. I went to Charleston, these are the 270 photos that I hit go with. Good luck getting anybody but your parents who probably lie to you saying they care that much. Paying attention. I'm not here to burst bubbles, I'm here to actually explain about that system. Yeah?
So we're going to be printing this 24 by 36?
We are going to be printing the 24 by 36. Oh, that's a great question about in color or black and white. I think that's up to the author on one level, because you guys saw I put up lots of photos on purpose for grayscale sequences.
For Friday, though, we want a high quality.
Yeah, I mean, I think to actually use this thing as an artifact, this would be something that you carry with you for the rest of the semester and might be part of your pinups. So when you print one of these, it's one time when you do this, right? We're not going to re-review these things over and over again the next 5 weeks. So the question about in color or not, I think you'd want to be very careful to take advantage. I know it's expensive on one level, although I've just printed a bunch of stuff for the most recent exhibit. Monica's not lying, not that we ever thought. I got a quote from Kinko's for this vinyl sticker stuff we're doing, and just to print, even if I brought the sticker to them, was 7 times the cost. So although you might, again, I understand things are pricey here and there, I do all my printing at school when I pay. Like, it's just, so make sure you take advantage. If you do want something in color, use it for surgically. But your process stuff using the OSE, great idea. Lucas.
The photos for this, are they restricted to the site, or is it anywhere in the house?
Oh, we'll get that was why, and I apologize if I wasn't trying to be coy. The area with which you can submit photos for this purpose is yes. You actually get to do what you deem a taxonomy of. So if something on Upper Broad Street is relevant to something at the Battery, go ahead. But yeah, our site proper is by no means the only taxonomy.
But it's not about it being a scavenger hunt to fill in the
Exactly.
If you want
Exactly.
to-
But if there's something important like a church steeple you see from the site that you want to catalog where that church steeple is, it can be very intriguing. Because Nick said, the Holy City idea, but we're going to see a lot of churches on Axis, okay? All right, so again, we'll walk through questions about photos. You guys can come up to me individually for the next 48 hours, all you'd like. My pleasure to talk to you about any questions you have. And of course, Nick and Jen are very savvy at all these things as well. I just mean to say, if you have any particular things. We'll see you at 10:30 at the school.